Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to the last stage of the marathon, which is drawing, making, drawing. So this is the seventh and final event in a series of events that have been taking place here in the drawing room over the past 7 days or so. Events have included in conversations exploring the ideas, process and working practices of Dryden Goodwin, who was the first speaker last Saturday. Francisca Furter, who was here on Tuesday. Thursday saw Charles Avery here as part of the project. And finally today, obviously, Cornelia Parker, who we are delighted to have here with us. Very lucky. She's so busy. Just back from Geneva. As part of the project, we've also been running a series of workshops. Those workshops have been with Tim Knowles, who's here, who's going to be speaking a bit later. So Tim Knowles, and then the second workshop was with artist Gemma Anderson, who's also here tonight. Is it tonight yet? And finally, yesterday we did a rather frantic and exciting workshop with Claude Heath. So this project is, for anyone who hasn't been here at all this week, is a very broad and expansive project in the sense that it obviously includes, as I've mentioned, workshops, talks, discussions, but also a display of works in the galleries. These works contribute to the project as a whole in the form of a kind of punctuation and reference points to the kind of evolving dialogue of the project over the last week or so. In Gallery 1 and Gallery 2, we have works by Tim Knowles, Gemma Anderson, Kate Aitken and Claude Heath. And importantly, in reference to the nature of the project as a whole, many of the works are in progress or collaborative works. So in Gallery 1, we have some works by Claude Heath, which he is currently working on as part of his PhD research at Queen Mary University. He wasn't sure whether he was particularly comfortable about showing them in an art context. It's very interesting to have those here. And he's just walked in the door, just as I'm talking about him, which is interesting. And then alongside some of Claude's work in Gallery 1, we have some work by Gemma Anderson, which is a collaborative series of drawings which Gemma's been making with mathematicians at Imperial College London. They're very unique drawings as they map a kind of process working with those mathematicians of visualizing two-dimensional DNA structures. So if you haven't already had a chance to have a look at them, do have a look after the talk. Here in Gallery 1, we have some provisional works and maquettes made by Kate Aitken, which are obviously works that she makes in the process of working out how her works develop into larger, more sculptural, large-scale pieces. And over here behind me and to my left is a large work by Tim Knowles, a very exploratory work, beautifully executed and displayed. And this work is in fact made by the movement of wind through the branches of a willow tree. So it was made in a circular formation, and here are the segments on the wall. Tim, like I say, Tim's going to talk a little bit about that later. By way of introduction, as the person responsible for this project, I should probably say my name's Jack Southern. I'm an artist, educator, and my creative output also spans writing and, to a degree, curatorial practice. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that I worked on for 2 years. Drawing, making, drawing, as I say, evolved out of the process of working on that book. I think I've got a copy here somewhere. That's Drawing Projects, this book here. That was a 2-year project, which very much culminated in the form of a book published by Black Dog in 2011. That book was co-written with Mick Maslin, who interestingly taught Cornelia while she was on her foundation at Cheltenham. Yep. So there's another link, which is interesting. All the artists involved in this project originally featured in the book. And as part of the chapter on Cornelia in the book, which I won't hold up because only some of you will be able to see it, we focused on a text which looked at Cornelia's interpretation and definition of drawing, which was a really interesting opening section to the book. It was the first kind of feature within the book by an artist. And that developed, as many of the conversations in the book did, from a visit that I was lucky enough to do with Cornelia in her studio. This week, the conversations that have evolved post the book this week have taken many different forms, which has been really interesting. So on Saturday, which is only a week ago, but it feels about 6 months ago to me now, but that was the Dryden conversation, which I mentioned earlier. Dryden and I discussed themes within his work that kind of span different working practices within what he does as an artist. And within those themes, we obviously referred to works. And so the conversation evolved through those themes. On the second, in conversation with Franziska Furter, Franziska chose to show a series of works and talk about them on her own, which led into a conversation which we then had. So that was a sort of 20-minute presentation she did about her work. A lot of the work she showed in that presentation focused on what she's doing in the studio at the moment, which is actually very different to some of her earlier works that she showed. So that was very interesting. And then on Thursday, when Charles Avery came to do his in conversation, he was very clear early on in the process of discussing how we were going to approach our conversation that he didn't want to show any projected imagery. He didn't want to show reproductions of his drawings, which is very interesting. So he actually brought 2 drawings that he was working on in the studio. So very much had a sort of symbiosis with the project as a whole, because we're really looking at the process by which drawings are made and how that thinking process develops into drawings that may then go on to be exhibited. So he brought 2 drawings into the gallery, which we could look at before and after the talk. One of which he left with us, which is on the wall in the hallway there, so you can have a look at that. So that obviously took a very different course, that discussion, because we weren't reflecting on imagery on the screen at all. We were just discussing his process. So it was a very kind of engaged conversation. And today, obviously, with Cornelia here, Cornelia and I decided that what we wanted to do was have a bank of images that we could refer to. So we wanted a conversation to be able to evolve quite naturally and fluidly, but be able to refer to works as we go along. So we have that bank of images on this computer. So what you'll probably find is that we'll both be referencing various drawings throughout the course of the conversation.
Flit around.
Flit around, yeah. So just to tell you a little bit about the format of this afternoon, Connie and I will talk for up to an hour, hopefully retaining a bit of time for questions. And then directly after that, what we're going to do is invite some of the artists, Claude's here, Gemma's here, Tim's here. We're going to invite them up to join us for a short panel in which we're going to reflect on the project as a whole. And that will involve discussing, obviously, the in-conversations and some things that have emerged out of those in reference to the project, but also, crucially, how the workshops have impacted the project as a whole. Because, like I said, we've been in a very dynamic situation here. We've been constantly changing between gallery situation to in-conversation to workshops. So that will happen directly after the discussion with Cornelia. In beginning, I'd just like to reference the feature in drawing books and the conversation in drawing books, because in drawing projects, drawing projects, because there was a very particular premise by which I undertook the interviews and the in conversations to generate the material for the book, and they were very expansive, open conversations in artist studios, where there was a real emphasis on perhaps talking about works that we may not most commonly see associated to that artist. So maybe works that have particular importance or personal significance, reference points perhaps in those artists' careers that that the artist feels are important. And when I originally went to visit Cornelia to discuss this, Cornelia was one of the artists alongside Dryden and Charles, etc., who were very open to this process. And when I originally went to visit Cornelia, I remember sitting in the kitchen, and which you probably don't remember.
I remember nothing of anything.
And you'd got these drawings out on the table, and this is a drawing made by Cornelia. We're going to flick to a different slideshow quickly so we can see a larger image. This is a drawing made by Cornelia when she was 18. So it was great, to turn up to Cornelia's house and find that she'd, in reference to what we'd discussed, these perhaps anchor points and thinking about a kind of lineage of how ideas and practice kind of evolve over time, Cornelia had picked up this drawing.
Well, my parents had, I think, recently passed away when I met you, and I inherited the drawing back, which I gave to them when I was 18. They'd had it on the wall, pride of place, and they thought it's the best thing I ever did as an artist. And when I was nominated for the Turner Prize, they asked me if I wanted to put it in the Turner Prize show, which I should have done, actually. It would have been much more interesting. But it was when I had just recently started my foundation at Cheltenham, Gloucestershire University, which is where you now head of fine art, isn't it? And working with Mick, and I was still stuck in the A-level art groove of trying to draw everything photographically. So I got this stuffed bird out of the library, this lapwing, and I laboured away, in my room at home on this bird. And then it ended up on my parents' wall for a long time, and then I got it back, and my daughter Lily, who was 8 at the time, said, "Wow, Mum, you can draw." She thought like my parents, my work was a bit dubious, and then she saw this and she thought, yes, she can draw. And then she immediately dashed off her own version of it, which I just thought was so much more spontaneous and wonderful and full of joie de vivre. And then she looked at it and she said, "Oh, Mum, it's a bit messy compared to yours." So she did another one, which I thought wasn't quite as exciting as the first one, but I think, I don't know, and then I think that's why we started our discussion about drawing, just because you have an idea of what drawing is at a certain point in your life, and now I rarely touch a pencil.
Yeah, and it was very interesting in relation to a chapter that we were writing in the book called Autographic versus Photographic. So, this idea of really deconstructing what it means to make a drawing which has kind of photographic qualities as opposed to making a drawing which has the expressive qualities of something autographic.
This bird looks like it's alive again.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a stuffed bird. I'd sort of more or less killed it off even more by drawing it, hair by hair, and then Lily had brought it back to life.
Yeah.
And then slightly killed it off again.
So it was really interesting that you were saying, on that day on the kitchen table that you much preferred these drawings.
Yeah, just because, I think we all, as kids, are natural mark makers, aren't we? And then we get we lose that because we become self-conscious, and then we're educated out of it. And then when you're at art school, there's always this thing about doing workshops, being blindfolded or, with your left hand, or just because you become so, educated into looking in a particular way. And that was, the whole point of foundation courses, in a way that they liberate you from, the constrictions of what you think drawing is about.
Yeah. But I do remember you saying that it was a sort of point of departure. Because
yes.
it made you realise that.
Well, in terms of looking back on my work, me getting this drawing back after me forgetting what I'd rejected in a way, and what I loved about Lily's drawing.
And there were other works that you showed.
Yeah, so my BA, I was studying painting, and I really wasn't a very good painter. And I was very frustrated by painting, because it all seemed to be about creating illusion on a flat surface, and I wanted something more physical than that. And I remember going down to the derelict houses near the art school and making little things like this, tearing off the wallpaper and repositioning it so it looked like light coming in through the window. And back in the studio I was trying to paint light coming in through a window and not succeeding. And this sort of eased me into sculpture, really. The idea of using things for what they were. This is wallpaper, pretended to be sunlight, but it is just wallpaper.
So rather than making renditions or illusions of things, actually using the
thing itself,
physicality of the material itself.
And that's something I realised I could do in sculpture. I mean, I was doing it in collage and painting, but it wasn't really, working for me. And then I think this was the turning point where I could actually admit to myself, not in the studio, but out in the derelict houses, that I really liked playing with materials and I liked making things physically in space. And then after my MA, which I did at Reading, I was working at home in Leytonstone when I just squatted a house in Leytonstone because I was trying to find a cheap studio, and I started working at home, and I have sort of been working at home ever since, really. I mean, I have got a studio now, but I use it for things of scale. But I made the biggest work from this house that I was in. I made my exploded shed, I made 30 pieces of silver, I made everything from a small room, really. But I've done my biggest works from the small space. But I started to use all the available space in the house, like the ceilings. So my drawings, this is, I think, I'm showing these just because I think this is when drawing went off the paper and it became something else. So I'll just quickly, this is just these things hanging off the piece of paper are little battleships cast from an original battleship I'd bought in a shop, a little wooden facsimile of a big thing. And then they were hanging on wires off the paper. So it's like a wave with fleet, when you look down from an aerial photograph, you look like ships at fleeting in the sea. And this was, you had to look up rather than down. Then I started cutting up the table and drawing on the table, put the original battleship on the table. I'll just show. And this was the next piece I made, which is referring to drawing, the idea of the blank sheet of paper on the ceiling. And I put screws in the ceiling and hung wires, and the wires became the drawing mark. And then on the bottom of the wires I was hanging lead casts of souvenirs from famous places. So this was the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And Gaudi, for his architectural drawings, really were great models made with bags of lead weight and cloth. And this is how he worked out all his technical drawings, really. And so I was sort of kind of playing homage to him. On the floor was another piece of paper, so it looked like this sculpture had made another drawing. And I think this was the last time I actually used paper and drawing in the work. I felt the work itself was really the drawing. I'll just quickly talk about that. That was these were lead casts of the Paris skyline. So you got the Sacré-Cœur, Eiffel Tower, all made into a little panorama that I'd bought in Paris. And then I suspended them upside down, and there was cast a shadow onto a sheet of paper on the wall, which became the drawing. And then I think my interest in photography emerged at this point, and somehow this shadow on the paper became the photograph, and then the sculpture became the drawing. This is another weird little work I did. It's a giant circuit board. This is what circuit boards used to look like. This is about this big. And I drilled it full of holes and had lots of wires coming through with black dried fruit on it. So it was prunes and raisins and all kinds of stuff. The complete opposite of, technology. And I did this sticky flow of energy, which I called it small thought. It was like trying to draw a thought process.
And Exhale School, this is 1995?
Yeah. No, this is 1990. This is a drawing covering the entire exterior of a schoolhouse in Glasgow as part of a festival. There was no money in the festival to make work, and this was a derelict schoolhouse, a just recently vacated schoolhouse, which had boxes of chalk left behind in the cupboards, and I decided just to use the chalk. So I decided I was going to do a drawing of the schoolhouse on the schoolhouse. So it was just tiny chalk marks made all over the schoolhouse, which is that thing about drawing the physicality of something. I thought of all the chalk marks ever made inside the school exhaling through the walls, but I just thought, this idea of touching a building all over while you're drawing it seemed to me far more satisfying than, sitting and trying to draw something that's in front of me. I had to draw on it, a bit like drawing on the table. And so this practice of drawing became the sculptural work.
And a very physical process.
Yeah. I mean, when you say something's touching or, feeling something, it's all very literal for me. This idea of, and the only deviation was around the windowsills, which I almost was referring to magnetic poles or something. But it was a very intuitive work. But it was on such an epic scale. And I thought the rain would wash it away, but it didn't. They had to get a big fire hose in the end to get rid of it. Because I thought it would rain and there would just be little patches left under eaves, and then it would be this kind of weird, curious process. But when the new owners got the building, they got this big fire hose and blasted it all off.
And through the process of working on the book, but also this project, what comes through very clearly with working with artists and talking about drawing a lot is that a lot of artists have a sort of personal definition of what drawing is for them and what it means within their practice and their process. And in one of the first conversations we had about your involvement in the book, I remember you saying, I don't know if you want me to quote you on this, but you said, I think of all of my work as drawing. I think of everything that I do as drawing.
Yes, I mean, I think drawing's always thought of the more lowly part of the spectrum of making work, that it's an aid to something else, it's not a thing in itself. And I always thought drawing should be at the top of the food chain, as it were, because it's almost like the old master drawings. When you look at them, you understand their work in a totally different way. When you see the paintings, they're all sealed off with varnish and they're finished and it's all in the bag. Whereas the drawings, you can see the thinking that's gone on. They're much more revealing, much more closer to the subconscious, I suppose. And that's what I like about drawing, that it's, the grander art forms are more finished off, whereas drawing can be finished off, or it could be provisional, it could just be a couple of marks, and it could be as minimal or as maximal as you want it to be. But it seems a much more essential practice somehow.
Is that quite liberating then, to think about a lot of what you do is drawing?
Yes. Then you don't have to be too precious about it. It means that the work doesn't have to be too complete. I mean, I think when I first approached sculpture, I was always worried about sculpture historically, because the history of sculpture, when you think of the history of sculpture, it's only really in the mid-20th century that it became, or since Duchamp really, became very multifarious and deconstructed or disintegrated. It always seemed to be about the lump before that. It always seemed to be about the thing on the pedestal and about heroicism and monuments, much more than painting. And so I kind of was, and then I came across Arte Povera, and I came across Yves Klein, Piero Manzoni, and their materials and the temporal quality of that, and the drawing quality of that, because they were using poor materials. Mario Merz, using branches of trees, and then to Joseph Beuys, the link, the interface between the sculpture having escaped the pedestal finally, can be drawing in space, really.
And there's a kind of flexibility within that process and that way of thinking about it, I guess.
Yes, definitely. And when I did the wrapping up Rodin's A Kiss, where was that? I remember I wrapped up Rodin's The Kiss. Oh, what's that?
It's good.
What does that mean? Okay. Wrapped up Rodin's The Kiss, which is a lump of marble, a very amazing, beautiful piece of marble, which I had made a temporary intervention with by wrapping up with a mile of string for the Tate Triennial. And this idea of using string as a line, I did think of this piece as a drawing, really, that it was a line drawing, and it enveloped this romantic idea of love. And the line became a piece of complication, so it was bound by the contours of the body. And because the kiss is such a familiar image in people's mind, most popular sculpture in Britain, people can visualize it without seeing it, really. And so I was taking away the bit that everybody visualizes, this intimate thing. And somehow by doing that, it reactivated it. It sort of, its absence became more, this absence of romantic love became more powerful. So the string was like the line drawing around the object. So I called it, instead of the kiss, it was the distance with string, a kiss with string attached. So it was a more complicated kiss, really. But there was this poor material versus the noble marble. When it was vandalized and people chopped off the string, a group of stuckists did a performance piece around it, and one of them had a pair of shears and chopped off the string, which I then tied back together and put it back on. But when the Tate wanted to prosecute the guy who'd done this, the police said, I don't think this is going to hold up in court. I don't think vandalism of a piece of string is going to be is going to be something you can defend. And I was saying, yes, too right. I didn't really want it to progress any further, but I thought that was very interesting that if the marble had been smashed, okay, But they said, what's been vandalised here? He said, well, they said, Cornelia Parker's work, And they said, oh, well, what's the work made of? And it's string. So there was no case to be made, which I thought was a very hilarious treatise on material.
In thinking about drawing in very broad terms, it's interesting to look at some of your works which use what we might think of as very unconventional materials, like melting down pornographic video tape in order to create an ink to draw with. You've made drawings with poison and antidote from rattlesnake from a Texas farm, was it?
Well, the rattlesnake venom came from a Texas snake farm, and the anti-venom was prescribed to me by a doctor, a Texan doctor, who was sympathetic to my cause. Seeing I got about half a pint of snake venom, he thought I might need to have some antidote. And then I made ink blots out of those. But I like this whole thing, I suppose, with drawing, when I was drawing the bird and trying to represent the bird on 2 dimensions, the idea that drawing can have, Rorschach blots are supposed to be empty of content. You're supposed to be able to look at them and then fill it up with your content, for you to project onto them whatever your dark thoughts are. And I thought, well, if you load up the blots with, poison or pornography, then, and call them pornographic drawings, or call them, let me show you my pornographic drawing. My mother would be turning in her grave if she'd known it. But this is one of the first ones I did, and so I made the chopped up videotape was given to me by the Customs and Excise, and they chopped it up because it was being confiscated because it was too lewd to be looked at. And then I reconstituted and made an ink, so I visualised it again. So, and all those Rorschach blots are always very phallic anyway. They're always very. And when I exhibited this, it was a group of other drawings in a show in Cardiff, 1996, I think, the first time I did one. And some builders came in and they said, oh, you can't show those. I hadn't even put the label up yet, it was pornographic drawing, because they thought they were too dirty. And then that guy who was the head of collections at Tate sent me a letter saying, oh, we would like to acquire some of your pornographic drawings for the Tate. I thought, great. And he thought that they were like Yves Klein, they were, women's bodies that have been pressed into paper. But that was really good because, he'd obviously projected onto these what he saw in them. So I was really interested in to do with the content of the work. That these things are abstract, but they are not abstract, they're representational because they're made of this material.
The material, yeah.
So I found that as something in drawing that I really was excited by, that the idea of I've just been given some fossilized dinosaur bones by a scientist up in Manchester, and they're all different colours, which is really beautiful. So I'm going to grind them up, and I'm going to do some dinosaur drawings with them. So they will all be different coloured drawings. I'm not sure what I'm going to draw yet, whether it's geometric patterns or what, but I love the fact that I'll be drawing with dinosaurs. And dinosaurs immediately have the connotation of the dinosaur lumbering across the landscape and the epic, time, collapses. Yeah. And so this is, for me, very exciting, the idea of, materials becoming a drawing medium, really.
And also with the hot poker drawings, that's eroding into a surface.
Yeah. How do I get back to the... the hot poker drawings, which I've been doing more recently.
Which you'll see on the front of the book. That's the cover of the book, isn't it?
Yes. That's why it's quite pertinent. This is one I did the other day. This one's about 1.5 metres by, it's pretty big. But I fold the paper and then I heat up a poker, that you poke the fire, which I spent my whole childhood, my job was to make the fires every day. You had 2 fires, we had an old cottage, and so I don't know, there's something very satisfying about poking the embers, and I'd leave the poker in the fire until it was red hot. I didn't do anything with it then. And then at school I learnt about Edward II, I think it's Christopher Marlowe play where Edward II dies from a horrible death using a red hot poker. And this idea of the red hot poker became almost like a torch, an instrument of torture. But then the idea of taking a piece of paper and making a very formal, tortured piece of paper, as it were, somehow appealed to me. And it's, again, a bit like the Rorschach block, that you can't control, you know, the burns, and sometimes they catch and you have to pat them out, or, you know, sometimes, you know, depending on the thickness of the paper too, you know, if you've got a big thick piece of paper and you folded it up, you know, you can't, you know, there's some little marks made, and then there's bigger marks at the edge. So I don't know, there's, for me, again, it's the physical thing. I wanted to physically etch the drawing into the paper, you know. I wanted the paper to take on the properties of the implement I was drawing with, which in this case was red hot poker.
It's interesting that you mention your job as a child, poking the fire, and in one of the conversations we've had previously, and I think there was some content about this in the book, we talked a lot about drawing as a sensibility, but also as a repetitive action, something kind of remembered, almost.
Like a choreography. Almost.
Like a choreography, yeah, exactly. And you talked about tying up tomato plants when you were a child, and then realising later on in life that some of those processes kind of evolve into your drawing process. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the sculptures particularly, you know, you have to, say, tie 1,000 wires, you know, but you can see every single wire, and then the wire itself, which I never use nylon thread, or I always want the wire in my work to be very visible and very much part of the physicality of the work, but you can see the time that's gone into it. So it's like, that's what I like about drawings too. If you look at a Van Gogh drawing, you know, you can see all the little strokes and all the energy that went into each little stroke, and it's a record of a time, you know. It's all there, it's all kind of laid down on paper, and so the wires in space very much like that. So there's all this childhood spent doing, you know, as of tying up tomato plants, thousands of them somehow carried on. It's almost like I'd already got it embedded in my fingers, and that would then get, you know, so the tedium of you know, burning holes in paper or sewing wire through paper or whatever.
On Tuesday, when Francisca was here, she was talking a lot about repetitive actions in making drawings. And she, you know, I don't know if you know her work, but she makes large-scale three-dimensional drawings, and she ties wire, you know, meticulously for hours. But she was saying that she often finds that she plays with materials in the studio, and through that repetitive action, she doesn't quite know what that action might evolve into and how it might become a work. And sometimes it doesn't, but other times it does. Do you have that similar kind of process with materials?
Definitely. I mean, I've got lots of materials that are waiting to become drawings, and sometimes I'll return to a material I used years ago and then start using it again because I've been processing it for a long time, and then I suddenly think, oh yes, this is what you know, this would be so much better way of using it. And so I feel like I've got this body of, you know, a vocabulary of materials, and then processes. And I don't know if you know, Richard Deacon's having this big show at the Tate, and his card came through the post the other day, and it had a list of materials from his show, which I just thought was so beautiful. You know, it was about 30 or 40 materials, and I just thought, wow, yes, you know, you get this thrill of pleasure that you know you're going to see all these materials in his works. And so yeah, I think it's like an alphabet almost, and I don't care in a way about the chronological progress of my work. I very often go back to things I've had years ago, and I've got bits of the Berlin Wall, you know, I've got bits of all kinds of stuff in my sort of bank of materials, and at some moment they'll come into play. I just wanted to show you one, for example. This is a piece I did up in so I was looking. Oh, here we go. This is my very hairy. This is the contents of a Hoover bag from from the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So the top red materials from the House of Lords, and the green material is from the House of Commons. And I got this years ago because I had a friend who worked as a secretary for Tony Blair, and she got me access to all kinds of stuff, including Margaret Thatcher's lavender, which I've still got in a bag and haven't done anything with that yet. But I put these, this was in the Baltic 2 or 3 years ago, and I put them in a glass slide and projected them onto a wall, so it became like a Rothko, you know, it was like a, and it reminded me of all the babble of question time at the House of Commons, you know, and it was like a hierarchical thing. You got the red over green, so it became a kind of red over green. I called it political abstract, but I don't know. So that was a material I got years ago, and then suddenly it came to be in this particular show. And similarly, talking about that, years ago, I took images of the budget bag, you know, so the budget bag that, you know, the chancellors hold. And the reason they hold it up like this is because the back of it is black. Which I think it's really funny when they do the budget, you know, in the red and in the black, you know, but they present this, it's almost like a shield, and I never knew why they did that. It seemed very odd. And then this particular bag, which has got retired now by George Osborne, he's made a facsimile of it, which is nicely distressed, I've noticed, which I thought, oh, how awful that is. I mean, because this one, at least all the damage is done by politicians over the last 150 years. And I love this because all the damage is there to see. And this was Gladstone bag. He had it on his table, and it sat flat on his table, and it had a handle on the top, you know, and you opened it up and he'd get his stuff out, his dispatch box. And then I thought, well, I really want to carry this with me, so he had the handle put on the side, so it became a briefcase, you know, and then he'd carry it around. And then it, you know, it became very symbolic, this bag. And then that's the back of it, which I really liked. And this is me holding the bag. So it's called Self-Portrait with Budget Box, which I showed a couple of years ago at the Royal Academy, and I'd, you know, worked with the budget bag many years before, but suddenly I really felt like I wanted my, you know, me with the, rather than just looking at fragments and making them into abstractions. I quite like the idea of showing the entirety. So that was another red, and the other one was red and green, the political abstract, and this was red and black. So that was just another. I'm just trying to. This, for example, is an image I took in Jerusalem last year, or about 18 months ago. On the top of the Mount of Olives, they have a sign, you know, like a plaque to show you where all the places are. You know, you can look down over, you know, the whole, the skyline of Jerusalem, and it will tell you, you know, where the Holy Sepulchre church is or wherever. And it's all been smashed up, and it's covered in chewing gum, and just below you are all these graves that go as far as the eye can see. And I somehow, and it's all, if you zoom in on this, you can see all the dots, the Ben-Day dots, because it's a printed plaque. And when I photographed it, I thought, wow, you know, this is an amazing drawing, and somehow sums up the complexity of what's going on in, you know, in Jerusalem, in the Middle East. And I think one or two of these photographs had a fly. If you honed in, you could see flies and crumbs of people's baguettes or whatever all over it. But I like the abstraction and the representation together, this kaleidoscoping. And I called it Broken View, this particular piece. And this one, where is it? And when I was in Jerusalem, I mean, and Bethlehem, everything looked too portentous. You know, there's this thing called the Jerusalem syndrome, where everybody who's very religious goes to Jerusalem becomes hyper aware of everything. You know, you might see a stain on the pavement, and it might look like the Virgin Mary, and so there's almost like a heightened sense of religiosity. And as a lapsed Catholic, I've still got a bit of that in me. So when I was there with my camera, and I was taking photographs of all kinds of things, from spilt milk in Jerusalem, an oil stain in Bethlehem, which was shown together as a diptych, my show last 6 months ago at the 5th Street. And then this, which I really loved, which was a tiny piece of rust, which looked like a cloudburst, and it was on this vessel, which is just outside the in the courtyard of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a very contested building which represents lots of different religions. And this is a bomb disposal containment vessel. So if there's a suspect parcel in the cathedral, they come and put it in here. So if it explodes, it will be contained. And I really like the fact that this was on it. So this is my Jerusalem Syndrome series. Again, a drawing, I think.
In looking at all these different approaches to drawings, there's a really lovely quote which I think is in the book, but it always comes into my mind, which is, your unconscious mind always knows more than your conscious. And I think you once said to me that the conscious part of making a drawing is deciding how you're going to approach making that drawing. So what materials you might use, what parameters define that drawing. But actually what comes out of that process may be filtered through the unconscious, and that's the journey that you go on from that point.
Because you've got to give you've got the concept or idea, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a kind of flimsy outline shell that you set up. It's like you say, I'm going out now to go to the shop to buy a pint of milk, so that's your concept. And on the way, all kinds of things might happen, and you might, get diverted all over the place, which I do all the time. But, giving myself the limitations, say, of a blank piece of paper and a red-hot poker to make a drawing, or, exploring a Rorschach blot, which is such a cliche in its own right, but you can explore what the content of that blot can be. It's quite liberating, so sometimes limitations are really useful, I was looking at these works made by the trees, which are really beautiful. I went to the Royal Mint a few years ago to watch money being made. I don't know why. And war medals being made. And I asked them if they put some I was doing a residency at the Science Museum at the time, in 1999, and I asked them to line the money chutes where the newly minted money comes pouring down with paper, and then the money all hit the piece of paper, and I got a silver one, a drawing that's a bit like this, with little silver marks on it, and I've got one that's a brass one, made by pennies when they were being minted there, and I call them drawings made by money. I haven't been able to sell them, though, sadly. Talking about gestures, talking about repetitive gestures. I made a film last year called Made in Bethlehem, which was made in Bethlehem. And it was at a Crown of Horns factory or workshop. And Mohammed Hussein, this gentleman here, has had this workshop for many years. And I filmed him making crowns and his son making crowns of fawns. But they made hundreds of thousands of them. They sit here in sort of semi-darkness on this old aircraft seat. And, it's like, Rumpelstiltskin. It's incredible. And I asked, in the video, which is only 6 minutes long, I asked them, ask Mohammed, how long he's been doing this. He said 33 years, which I thought, was amazing, seeing that's when Jesus died, and that's where he was. But these crowns of thorns are supposed to be made from the bushes nearby, which, they would have taken, but I just thought somehow, and then he talks a little bit about, Palestine and what's happening there now, and, he's a sort of, I think he came from a Bedouin past, that he's been somebody who moved around, and his family did, and then they resided in Jerusalem. But, he's making crucifixes and crowns of thorns in a kind of Jewish-occupied state. There's a lot of complexity there. And somehow through the making of the crowns of thorns, all this stuff could be talked about in a very simple way, because they had to kill hundreds of hours, 33 years of making crowns of thorns, all those hours that you'd have to think and meditate. So that was, another kind of drawing in a way. But I do like the idea. This is just recently in my show at Frith Street. I made this is more recent than that. I've just made this, but this is a drawing using bullets that have been melted down and drawn into wire, and then I've got a piece of tracing paper and sort of stabbed it with a sharp point, and then I joined up the crosses, and then I made this kind of Rorschach of holes that I printed into a piece of paper. Then I used the bullet, which had been made into wire, and the process is called drawing. And then I sewed the paper like a sampler. So I did one of these for the first for the drawing room, for the drawing room auction, which is, drawing room auction's always great because it somehow makes you try a new thing, a new little hybrid. But when I was doing this, and it looks like it's out of focus, it's not, it's because I've done offset it and then done the crosses again, so it's called crossfire, this, very cliched. But the back of it I like particularly, because the back is unconscious, you know, you're trying to organise all these kills or sort of notches or whatever in cross stitch, but then the back, I never bother about the back. But I like the back, and so I make them two-sided so you can see both sides. And the reason I showed the back was, I don't know, I always love the backs of, you know, when you see buttons sewn onto card in street markets. This is not buttons, this is fishing hooks, Spitalfields Market, but I particularly like the back of it. And I've got loads of photographs like this. This is what I do all the time, is record things that I see that I might sometime be able to incorporate into works. And, you know, I've done this for years, and it's only now that I'm starting to do this thing about the back and the front, which I really like.
And in mentioning the bullet drawings, you talked about this conceptual play on words in terms of, you know, if you melt down metal and you pull it through a gauge, the process is called drawing.
Yes.
But also what's really fascinating about them in reference to the word drawing is that I think when you see them, especially when you see the shadow when they're exhibited, it looks like a beautiful pencil line from a distance before you actually see its physicality.
Yeah, I think what's lovely about the lead for the bullets, it just looks like pencil lead, whereas I've drawn, you know, wedding rings which are gold, or, you know, identity bracelets which are silver. I mean, this, sorry, it's a very bad slide, but this is a piece I also did in the show in Jerusalem, where I took one bullet and made a square on the wall, and it was just wound round pins. But I like this idea of this, a bit like the city of Jerusalem in a way, was its wall, you know, that this bullet becomes a mapping out of a territory, really. And this kind of drawing, I've shown one of these in China as well. This one had 12 nails in it, and the one in China had 8 nails or something. But I don't know, when you start to move this bullet around and drawing out this square, you know, it becomes a much more political thing somehow, the context of where it is. So, you know, I was thinking about Tiananmen Square. I mean, although really the square is just a formal trope, and in a way, but the square has this other meaning. And I like, again, a bit like the abstract, the pencil mark, you know, looks, you know, this pencil mark looks abstract, but when you know it's a bullet, it becomes truly representational. So I've made various bullet drawings. This is a bullet drawing that's where I've taken a target that I drew out for a marksman to shoot through. I thought, well, I like the actual target I've drawn out. I'm going to make that in bullet rather than get somebody to shoot through it. So the target itself became the bullet. And this is one which is like a net, which is trapped between 2 sheets of glass. But this idea of drawing, you know, wire drawing, because I've suspended things on wires for years, and I thought the idea of using, you know, this, when I took the sculptures down, there'd be a little bit of wire left, and I really liked it, and thinking, how can I make that into a drawing? So I started to have objects melted down and made into wire. The very first one I did was a wedding ring drawing, which is 2 wedding rings melted and made into, I thought, what can it measure? And so I thought the circumference of a living room. So there's about 50 foot of wide. I thought, what's that the measurement of? Well, it's the circumference of a very small living room. But I like the idea of these wedding rings, which are, the material, it's very springy. It's not like the lead. I can do lots of things with the bullets, but I can't do much with wedding rings because they're too springy. And they kept snapping and breaking, and then I'd tie them knots in them. And it's a bit like marriages that, you know, have lots of patches and lots of tangles, and it's a bit like divining or something. You look at it and you think, oh, you know, the wedding, you know, marriages are quite complicated things. And I think this was a prototype for me later doing the wrapping the kiss in a string. You know, it's this idea that knots and threads and what they are can be really, you know, quite, you know, if there's a knot in a wedding ring, it's different from having a knot in a piece of string. You know, so the line becomes this physical object.
And, you know, obviously everybody knows that a characteristic within your work is taking things from the everyday, taking things that are kind of ubiquitous. that are around us, that are to hand, and then putting them through some sort of, I don't want to use the word violent because everybody seems to, but putting them through some sort of process, you know, whether that's flattening them, blowing them up, shooting them, etc.
Drawing them.
Drawing them, yeah.
But I think there's so much violence and friction in the world anyway, not necessarily just literally in wars and, you know, combat and all the rest of it. I mean, you know, when I was living in Leytonstone, in this house I squatted, and then I moved into another flat nearby, which I lived there for 10 years, and we're all, about 200 or so artists out there, including Grayson Perry and Paul Noble and lots of people. And we're out there because it was cheap housing, and we got, you know, a studio. And then it all got knocked down to for a motorway in 1994, and that community dispersed. But it was, you know, I think we all lived with the threat of it for a long time. And I think that's where my steamroller work came from, you know. But I was back there since that happened. And this photograph was taken quite a few years ago, but it became a multiple that I published with the special edition of the book. And I call this Truth to Materials. And this is this, you know, painted man crossing, but he's got a big lump of tarmac on his head. And I just thought, well, I know how he feels. This is a bit like when our houses got knocked down from the motorway. So this particular little, almost, I mean, I apologise to Richard Wentworth. This feels like more like a Richard Wentworth moment. But, you know, but I thought this mantra of truth to materials, which I'm kind of starting to think about more and more. You know, this is material. This is tarmac doing what it does best, at the expense of man, really.
Does that idea of materials being true to their properties and exploring what they can do, does that come from a kind of sculptural background, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when I was at art school, I mean, I went to art school in the 70s to Wolverhampton Poly after I left Cheltenham. The only place I could get into it, the whole country, was Wolverhampton Polytechnic. I didn't really want to apply there, but it had one last pool choice, and they very gratefully, I'm glad they took me in. But I had a brilliant time there. I really loved it. But it was a very macho school. I mean, it was 70% men. When I was in my first year, there was one girl in the third year doing sculpture. And when I was in my second year, there was 2 in the year ahead of me. And in my year, there's 3. And now, you know, you never find that. You know, I was at a prize giving last night, and most of the prizes went to women, just by coincidence. But and the sculptor prizes, you know, the 4 people shortlisted were women. But I just felt, and it was all very much this mantra, which was, perhaps they were quoting Henry Moore about truth to materials, which was, you know, if you're going to use a piece of wood, you go with the grain, you know, you work with the material, and you stay true to that material. So I kind of think I've tried to do that myself. Yeah.
And in relation to drawing?
Yes, these are my charcoal drawings. 2 churches, one struck by lightning and one arsoned. You know, the arson one is a black congregation church from Kentucky, and the one struck by lightning was a white congregation church from Texas.
Within this idea of staying true to materials, you know, you've always said that it's very important to point out that, you know, these aren't drawings of churches.
No.
They're the actual material of the church, but they form an abstraction. They move from something literal to an abstraction.
Yes, I mean, so these were, I would light the walls and not the piece, you know, so you get this black silhouette. And this is the Mass, which was a church struck by lightning, and it's made of little particles of 2 by 2, you know, it was like a 50s church, and it had a wooden frame, so the bits were naturally small. Whereas when I came to Kentucky church, this was a clapboard church, you know, like a Victorian church, and so it had big timbers. But although I tried to treat them exactly the same way, there's 8 years between the 2 pieces. The second piece, anti-mass, there's mass and anti-mass, looks more strident, basically, because the timbers are big, and there wasn't any of this little particulate stuff. So somehow, you know, one's the so-called act of God, which is a lightning strike, one's the so-called act of man, which is the arson. Somehow there's a stridency to the second church that was just coincidental. That's what I mean by truth to materials, you know. I mean, I didn't, you know, I decided I was going to use the Kentucky church before I even saw it, so I didn't know the timbers were going to be big. But I like that. That's somehow what happens all the time in work. and the fact that the bullets are so much more pliable than any of the other metals that I've melted down. It means that you can sort of sew with them, which I really like. You know, this idea of, I always love this thing where, you know, you had the cigarette case that deflected the bullet, you know, but, you know, if you could make your clothing out of bullets, you know, that's another thing, like chain mail or something. Oh, I'll just quickly show this. I suppose this is a piece that, I don't know if any of you know this, but it was in the Royal Academy Summer Show last year. I'm not sure if any of you go to the Royal Academy Summer Show, but I'm now a Royal Academician, and the Royal Academy Summer Show is kind of interesting because the commerciality of it's really quite jaw-dropping. and this is my photograph of somebody else's work in the year before Summer Show. And what I did was, this was the most popular, it sold the most works. And what I did was take away the image, which is of a bird, and which has proved very popular. And then I put this in this year's Summer Show, and then I got some dots myself. and you know, and I'm hoping that this is a photograph which I will put in this year's Summer Show, and hopefully get some more dots, or might get one dot because it gets more and more abstract. But I quite like that what I was selling was a kind of abstraction in a way, and what the people were buying before was the opposite. But I've never seen this anywhere else, have you, where they stick the dot on the frame when they've sold something. So if it's really popular, you can hardly see the image. But anyway, so it's a little in-joke. I call it stolen thunder. But anyway, but I think, again, that as being a drawing, really.
And there was a number of found drawings that you thought would be interesting to show.
I'll very quickly whiz through them, and then this was in Hebron. This is above a street market, and this is stuff that settlers have thrown down on the tarpaulins over the market. So there's all this, people have to put these tarps up to stop all the debris coming down. And I just did lots of photographs of the shadows of these objects. This is bullet holes in Hebron again, in a water tank on top of one of the houses. Just a small village in the West Bank. Another one. This was in Selfridges. Looked like a Channel 4 logo, but made out of tape. This is again in Hebron. This is Palestine signed a wall hastily put up as a roadblock. It is a blood stain outside my house where I used to live in Shoreditch. This is a camel on top of the Mount of Olives. This is in Garden of Gethsemane. This is where the people stub out their cigarettes, which I really like that. It's like the Holy Ghost. This is on the Chapel of Ascension on the top of the Mount of Olives. This is taper marks on the wall, which I really like. This is in Texas. This is a festival. I really like these. This is in where is this? This is out in Broadchalk, a flower show. I like the stain that made. This is in Broadchalk too. So I like these little abstractions here. People are selling 50p, 30p, 20p, 10p, 8p, and 6p. This is in Granada, in the Alhambra. This is an angel that's got a spout coming out of their face, but it's all covered in masking tape. Not masking tape, and gaffer tape or packing tape, which I really liked. Very bad light, that's why it's very abstract. This is in New Zealand. You see this all over New Zealand. It's really weird, not bras particularly, but people leaving their trainers, or travellers just leave something on a fence and then somebody else will add something to it. And this was a whole load of bras, which I really loved. This one particularly. That might be the first one they put down. These backs of buttons that I was telling you about earlier. This is back in Texas. This was in, where was this? I think this might have been in Italy. This is in Portugal. People putting pieces of slate into a cliff face. Just don't know why. This was in Belgium, last dag. I know it means last day, but it's a very portentous jewellery shop window in Ghent. Oh, this is this blocked off street in Hebron and Moor Market. This is at the top of St. Peter's in Rome. You know, tourists have stuck all these stickers on this piece of glass right at the very top, which I really liked. And this is in the Colosseum in Rome. And that is the floor of the Sistine Chapel, undersung, I think. I can't remember when that is. And this is in the drawing room toilet, by the way. Lovely piece of drawing in there, I think. Look at that, a face, if you ever saw one. And that's it.
When was the one taken in the drawing room toilet?
I did that a few weeks ago. I thought, wow. Wow, yes, no, I was thinking of putting them in for the next drawing auction. Working them up into a masterpiece. But look at that, it's great, isn't it? I just thought it's very pertinent. But I've got hundreds of those kind of, photographs.
And what usually happens to them? They stay on your computer and...
Yeah, I usually have them on my iPhone, and they'll either fall off the edge or I'll archive them, and then I mean the iPhone now is my sketchbook. I remember when I used to carry a sketchbook round and draw things out. It's weird. It's become the drawing tool, and in fact, a piece in my show at Fifth Street a few months ago, which was this series of photographs, all taken on my iPhone, of Pentonville Prison wall, builders filling in the cracks on the wall, and I just thought they were great, abstract expressionist works. They've been painted out as I was photographing. The magnolia was going on that's the hastily grabbed image.
They look a bit like Franz Klein.
They do.
Monochrome paintings.
Motherwell, Clifford Still, all kinds of people. And then this is what they look like when they're framed up. And it's called, and what was brilliant about them was 2 hours after I took the photographs, a prisoner escaped over the wall. I just thought it was amazing. They'd filled all the cracks in, they'd painted the wall, and then somebody escapes. So I called it Prison Wall Abstract, and then in brackets, a man escaped. But so yes, that's my sketchbook, is my camera. And I remember I used to lug a big camera around and sort of wait forever to have them processed and all the rest of it. And now we live in this. I'm sure you've all got images like that on your phones, because it's just a great way of gathering material.
Immediacy of capturing.
Yeah.
As it's gone 4 o'clock, we better retain just a few minutes. Does anyone have any questions for Cornelia?
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering about the titles of your work.
The what?
The titles that you give your work, and how that brings in. Does that bring something extra in for you? Do you title all your work, or
yeah, I think
and how that connects with your thought process and the physical process?
Yeah, sometimes the title is a bit like a starting point, or sometimes it's an object. I've photographed a phrase and a piece of graffiti, but I collect titles where I collect materials, and they sit around. So I have titles I haven't made works for yet, or I have titles like Hanging Fire, which I like the idea of fire having gravity, which is a phrase, hanging fire. And I'll have these things sitting around, or they will be cliched things like From Here to Eternity, or Look Back in Anger, or found titles. And then I'll just have them sitting around, and then they'll find a place, a bit like the materials.
Like they come together.
Yeah, but I think titles are really important. I just think of them as another material, really. And so I did a workshop, talking about workshops, I did a workshop which turned out sort of like to be a drawing workshop in Odense in Denmark years ago to an academy. And we had a titling. I concentrate on titles for it because I think it's something people don't bother with mostly at art schools, and they just think of something at the last minute and put it on. And very often it doesn't help the work, or it explains it away, or it doesn't give it a charge. And what we did with this, it was about found objects and titles. So we told people to go out and find a found object And we created almost our own Believe It or Not museum. And people would bring a pizza box with some scratches in it while they cut a pizza up. And then we all had titles. And then, so they'd title their pizza box or something. And then what we did was move the titles along the wall. So that title became, so the pizza box in the end was called The Ground Plan of My Grandfather's Summer House. So we worked with all the titles until we found the right one that worked with the pizza box, and then it became a work of art. And so very often the titles are a bit like that. You find a title, you found an object, and even those two together. I don't know if my goblets are in this. I don't think they are, but I did a pair. Somebody gave me a pair of silver goblets that were very tarnished as a present, thinking I might squash them. And then I liked them very much for their tarnish, so I called them 20 years of tarnish, and then in brackets, wedding presents, because they were, the person who had polished them had been divorced, and so they'd been laid there neglected for 20 years. That's a tarnish collected on a handkerchief, although it looks like a giant phallus. It's David Crockett's soup spoon, and so it kind of, somehow people don't want tarnish, but the 20 years of tarnish, thinking that was an object somehow, the object of the piece was the tarnish and how long it took to accrue, and the fact it was neglect and the fact it belonged to, somebody who's now divorced. Somehow those two things together made the work. So it's just a found object as a title. And then I'm thinking about tarnish, and I thought, And this title I used for the red spots was called Stolen Thunder, which is to steal somebody's thunder. And I called these Stolen Thunder because I had all these famous people's silverware that I polished, or metalware like Henry VIII's arm and codpiece, polished codpiece, Samuel Cox soup tureen, or Charles I spurs or whatever. So I had all these tarnishes, but they belonged to famous people. So I stole their fame, leaving them nice and polished, but I got their dirt. Because tarnish is what nobody wants. But I love the word tarnished reputation. I might see that and think, that's a great title, I'd like to make a work with that or that idea. So a lot of the work comes from linguistic connections as well, and with material.
We might have time for just one more question, if anyone has one.
There's one over there.
Sorry. I was really interested by a comment at the end of your icon as a sketchbook.
Yes.
I wondered if you could comment a bit on whether you think that's changed our way of observing things, how instantaneous it is, and appreciating objects as compared to previously the work on concentration that would have been required to represent something in a sketchbook, or to feel and touch the material and appreciate it there.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm sure it has. I'm sure that kind of, the way mobile phones have allowed people to connect up with each other and not spend hours waiting on street corners trying to meet up when you, it's just transformative, really.
Does it change your practice the way that you, because for example, when I'm drawing something, there's something around the duration of time that you will draw it, when you make a literal representation or not, something about that passage of time that changes during that time.
I think of the prison wall abstracts are more rare in my work than, say, the bullet drawings when I'm throwing through paper, which are quite durational and you have to spend a lot of time, and it's kind of mindless work, and it requires some concentration, and that liberates you to listen to Desert Island Discs or whatever you're listening to. But I love the long drawn out thing, but I also love the immediate thing, because I think our lives are made up of immediate things, and grabbing those prison wall things before they disappeared, I'd walked past them many times but never did anything about them, and then there they were about to go, so I thought, quickly. And I think, for me, I think it's been brilliant. I love it. It's quite a liberation. Because I realised actually when I was a student, I never really drew things from, I never went out and drew things. I'd note down ideas, or I would have a camera but there was something not very immediate about the camera that you really would take. You know, I've got rolls of film that I've never developed, you know, and I've got such a terrible memory in a way. What I love about the iPhone is, you know, you think, oh, I did that earlier today. You know, I think as I get older, I like the, you know, not having to lug a big heavy thing around, not having to necessarily remember my sketchbook. You know, my eyesight's going, the camera's being, sometimes I photograph things because I can't even see them, and I think, oh yes, back at home on my computer I can see it, I think, oh, that was something else. So, I mean, I think artists are very adaptable, and I think, I don't know what Michelangelo would have done if he had an iPhone, but I don't know, I think it's very liberating myself.
I don't know whether this is true or whether I should mention it, but I remember talking to Mick once about you being in his drawing workshops when you were a foundation student, and he said sometimes Connie didn't do that much drawing, but she'd notice everything. So she'd walk around the room and just really, really carefully look at everybody else's drawings and really notice things, and you could tell that she's just being very perceptive and picking things up about other people's work.
And then at home,
But that's quite interesting in relation to what you're saying now.
Yeah, no, I think looking is the most important thing. And if your subconscious will absorb it. I mean, I don't worry too much about my bad memory because I've just got to live with it. But somehow that's what I mean about the subconscious knowing more than the conscious. You know, you absorb things, and after a while things start to stick, and that's what I think the iPhone does. You know, you start to notice, you know, little bits of tape on the floor like that number 4. You know, it's all. I mean, I've got lots of photographs like that. A bit boring to show loads of them, but you know, you think, oh, this is some little trope, and then that might develop into something I might do, you know, drawing or sculpture or drawing. And so I think it's, you know, when you start to be obsessing about a certain thing like cracks in the pavement, which I haven't shown you pictures of, but you know, then, and I became quite obsessed with cracks in the pavement. In the end, I had to make a bronze crack in the pavement just because somehow I've just got to get this out.
Bubbling away.
It was bubbling away. And it's been bubbling away for years, and you've got lots of hundreds of photographs of cracks in the pavement all over the world. You think, perhaps I should do something about this. And then I can move on.
Okay, well, we're going to take just a few minutes break, and then we're going to invite Tim, Claude and Gemma up just to have a short discussion about the project as a whole. But I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Cornelia for being here today. It was fantastic.